This video is for chapter 10 from your textbook. That chapter is on sexualities. Um, One thing that kind of sets these lecture slides and video apart from previous lecture slides and videos is, although I do go over the bulk of the material from the chapter, I don't necessarily do it in the order that it's presented. And that's because a lot of this material is kind of co-opted from Lisa Wade, who's one of your textbook authors, is from her book, American Hookup, which is a book that I've taught in my class when I've taught 3408 in the past. And so for that reason, I don't necessarily think the structure of this chapter, makes the most sense. She doesn't necessarily provide a lot of context for some of these concepts, and the order can be a little funky. So, for that reason, just know that, the video aligns with the lecture notes, but the lecture notes are not, perfectly, ordered, reflecting the order of how the ideas are presented in the chapter. And of course, there, like always, there's additional information going beyond the scope of the textbook. So, just kind of be aware of that as you are reading and studying. So, we began our discussion around sexual identity and sexual orientation in chapter 5 when we were talking about intersectionality and the matrix of domination and accompanying gender strategies for our different social identities. So, this is just a reminder of those kind of primary terms. Once again, just kind of emphasizing that although we tend to use the very popular threefold categorization of homosexual, heterosexual, and bisexual. Sexual orientation, like gender, is really more of a continuum. There has also been kind of the emerging category of asexual as a sexual identity, pushing back against the medicalization of lack of sexual attraction, that it's not a medical or psychological disorder, it's just a different form of sexual identity. Once again, just a reminder, hopefully at this point of the semester, you are all, if you came into this course with this bad habit, hopefully you've broken yourself of it. But, gender and sex identity is not the same thing as sexual orientation. So you can't necessarily tell someone's sexual orientation, based on their gender expression, right? How effeminate or how masculine they are. That's some real compulsory heterosexuality, hegemonic masculinity type of thinking. And hopefully we are all beyond that at this point. This is maybe a better representation. There are a lot of different representations of that continuum. But, we do know that sexual identity is a continuum that's been pretty clear since early research, Kinsey's 1940s research on human sexuality, that kind of showed that not as many people as you would think have had exclusively heterosexual or exclusively homosexual experiences in the course of their lifetime. And for that reason, it's sometimes very difficult to measure sexuality because people may engage in same-sex behavior, sexual behavior, but they don't necessarily identify as being homosexual or even bisexual, or even, to throw out, one of our newer terms, even like pansexual. They might very much identify as heterosexual, but have had, same-sex desires, or, even, same-sex sexual experiences. So that makes the whole question about what determines sexual orientation kind of tricky to add. There are people who spend a lot of time on studying this. And of course, and there's a lot of research around, both cultural factors as well as biological factors. And here I am just kind of narrowing it down to one quick slide. But, just know that we do know that culturally, if there's a diversity of sexual expression around the world, and we do know that cultures that are more tolerant and embrace a wider variety of sexual identities, unsurprisingly, they have more people in their population who adopt those identities because they are presented as being, legitimate identities and relationship, options. But then there are people that really focus on, like, the biological factors, and the idea, in the words of Lady Gaga, are people really born that way? Is sexual orientation largely fixed at birth? And so these types of studies, they focus on genes, hormones, epigenetic research. There's looking at kind of uh, twin studies, between identical and fraternal twins that have been, adopted and raised in different families. All of that, trying to answer that question. We don't have a definitive answer. So that means for, like, a lot of sociological research, we just go by, the identity that people claim, even though we are aware that if we were to define sexual orientation in a different way, like based on, have you ever had a same-sex experience, or, what percentage of your experiences have been same-sex experiences, or, do you have same-sex desires? We know that that would probably yield us a much greater number than people who actually claim the identity. And there was a study that did show that, that showed that, the number of people who report any homosexual activity is far greater than the number of people who then go on to claim either a bisexual or a homosexual identity. And particularly, once again, we see that for at least female respondents. And there is some qualitative research that says that the gap between men and women there shouldn't be as big. But once again, we have some social desirability bias going on where, even when promised confidentiality, you just have, male respondents maybe less likely to be willing to report past homosexual activity if they don't claim a homosexual or bisexual identity. And so why would they be so reluctant to claim that, right? Well, it has a lot to do with how our society is structured and how we have typically, perceived and depicted and treated people who are homosexual. So once again, these are terms from chapter 5. So just a reminder, that to be masculine and feminine in most Anglo-European societies is to be heterosexual. And it's that concept of compulsory heterosexuality, that heterosexuality is the default or the obligatory sexuality. It's the status that provides, the institutional privileges. And going along with that is the idea of heteronormative, which speaks to how our society is structured. We live in a society where, we assume people, are going to, be interested in people of the opposite sex, right? We set up courts, prom court, homecoming court, around the idea of a king and queen, opposite sex, and they have a dance, right? When we see little children playing together, we make comments like, oh, that's your little boyfriend or your little girlfriend, right? Just assuming that that is, how, these children who at this point, aren't necessarily even probably thinking about dating or sex, we're kind of putting that identity on them. And really, maybe the best example around heteronormativity and compulsory heterosexuality is the fact that, you don't have to come out as heterosexual because that's just what you're presumed to be. No one asks, when did you know you were straight? However, when did you know you were gay is a very common question. And that is a privilege, to not feel as if you have to explain your sexual desires. And so there is this questionnaire that was created to kind of make that point. It's called the heteronormative questionnaire. And I pulled a couple of sample questions to give you a sense of, how the types of questions that we ask people or think in our heads about people who are homosexual, how, it doesn't even almost sound right to substitute heterosexuality for homosexuality. And it doesn't sound right because, of course, we've just been raised to think of heterosexuality as being normative, while we've been raised to think of homosexuality as being deviant. And that the fact that we kind of think about it that way, and and sometimes I have students like, well, it's always been that way, but that's where it actually gets really like funny from a historical standpoint, because heterosexuality and homosexuality are actually relatively recent concepts. 1902 and 1897. And they were invented by Victorian era sexologists. And, if you read some of those early theories, like a lot of pseudoscience, they sound super crazy because, it was based on a lot of assumptions and bias, and not necessarily, the type of scientific rigor and objectivity that we associate with science today. So these labels were created. They created categories for behavior. And, before that, it's not that people weren't engaging in homosexual acts, sexual acts with people of the same sex, but previously those acts did not define them as a person. It was an act that they engaged in. But after, the Victorian era and these concepts were created, instead it kind of became an identity, that people were labeled with. And in most cases, this was a marginalized, stigmatized identity, one that came with a good deal of prejudice and stereotyping and discrimination. And that pretty much was the case for a long period of time, until we start to reach the late 1960s, in the early 1970s, in the midst of all of our other kind of movements: the civil rights movement, the women's movement, Black Power movement, Brown Power movement, Red Power movement, so many movements. And so we have the gay rights movement, where this is the first time like that a unified message was kind of pushed, that the problem wasn't homosexuality. It was actually the discrimination and the stigma and the prejudice that gay people faced. And so, your book does discuss the significance of the Stonewall Riot in 1969. And this is in New York. And it was just about kind of the police harassment that gay men, as well as transgender, women in particular, kind of faced from law enforcement, how they would be harassed, at their bars and their after hour spots, that they were always just kind of being rounded up and arrested for no good reason. And then finally, at some point they were just like, we had enough. They fought back, and it was just kind of an extended, kind of couple weeks of pushing back against this mistreatment. And coming together as a community to kind of say we deserve better than this. And one important consequence of that, as your book discussed, was the creation of the organization, the Gay Liberation Front. And so you want to think about this like any other civil rights organization. The focus was on, getting equal treatment for people who were homosexual in the community. And in the same way that the Black Power movement had Black is Beautiful, this is where that, if you've ever heard Gay is Good, that motto, it comes out of this time period. And there were some successes, right? Homosexuality was declassified as a mental disorder in 1973. Before that, it was right there in, the DSM for all of my psychology people. So, people would be diagnosed as having a mental disorder if they were homosexual. And they eliminated that in 1973. You have the emergence of gayborhoods in places, like San Francisco and New York and Chicago, where people that were part of the community were, able to form supportive communities where they could, go out with their partners to, restaurants and bars and clubs, and, rent homes and apartments, and have an increased amount of like safety and security and freedom than, what they had had. And then we also had our first openly gay politician elected in San Francisco in 1977. And this is also when, they introduced the term homophobia, right? They named, they named this discrimination and this prejudice that they were experiencing from people, and there's a lot of power in naming. Now, some of these kind of great strides in the 70s, there was unfortunately a setback, in the community of just a really sad, health crisis, and that was the AIDS epidemic. Um, HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, which causes AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, is largely, but not always, sexually transmitted. Um, you can kind of see, like, at least in term and these numbers used to be a little different back in the 80s, before we were more aware of HIV AIDS. There was, an increased likelihood that you would get it from injection drug use, or, in those early years, even like blood transfusions and medical procedures. But now, especially, it's primarily sexually transmitted, and most new cases of AIDS result from men having sex with other men. But among the women who have it, the greatest source of new cases is sex with men. But admittedly, oftentimes those men that they transmit the disease to them, a good number of those men actually got the disease from having sex with other men. So, that's kind of the current trend, in cases in the United States currently. Our cases and deaths have decreased. This is nothing like, what it was when it was at its peak epidemic levels, in the early 80s. But it's also worth noting that a lot of those deaths could have possibly been prevented if the US government was just not so slow to respond to the AIDS crisis. They did not give serious attention until the epidemic began to spread to the heterosexual population. And before that, it was largely seen to be a disease that was limited to the gay male population. And there was even kind of a derogatory term for it, called GRID, which is an acronym that stands for gay-related immune deficiency. And so since the 1980s, as more resources have been allotted to research and the medical treatment of the disease, there have been important advances. And so thus people who are diagnosed as HIV positive, and even people who get AIDS, can live with the disease longer and remain healthier. That being said, it's still the most lethal of all the STIs. So, kind of keeping in mind that, they had this successful kind of, run in the 70s of gaining rights, but then they had, the community had a very hard decade of the 80s, largely because of, the AIDS epidemic, and not just the sickness and the death that kind of rocked the LGBTQ community, but also just the increased kind of stigma that was then associated with being gay, because people were so afraid of the disease. So there was an increase in prejudice and discrimination. So when you think about it like that, it becomes less surprising that marriage just wasn't a prominent issue until, for most gays and lesbians, until the mid to late 1990s. And so you can kind of start to see when it became an issue that they began pressing for, when you look at the policies that were passed, that kind of pushed back against their activism. Because what we see during the 1990s is the fact that, the military had the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. And then the Defense of Marriage Act, which is frequently called DOMA, it also kind of brought recognition and public attention, because what DOMA did was it pretty much defined marriage. It was a congressional act that defined marriage as being between a man and a woman, and that was in 1996. And so, this is just a kind of timeline of the fight for marriage equality. From 1996 to 2009, although different things were happening at the state level, and you can see that, some states, began to legalize it, as early as 2004, but then some states also explicitly banned it. It wasn't until 2009 when President Obama declared that DOMA was unconstitutional and the Department of Justice would no longer defend it in court that we started to see kind of a swifter uptake. Because by saying that the Department of Justice was no longer going to defend it in court, it kind of set the issue on like a very fast-paced course to the Supreme Court. And that's largely what happened. Because in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down DOMA. They said it was unconstitutional. And so as we then set the stage for the 2015 Obergefell-Hodges decision that basically said states had to allow same-sex couples to marry and must recognize same-sex marriages from other states, you can kind of see that we had just an amalgamation of states doing different things. It was prohibited in 33 states. It was permitted in 17 states in the District of Columbia. And, so it obviously had the makings of just being a very kind of contentious issue because, and that is exactly what happened because people move around, right? A lot of us don't stay in one state, one state our entire life. So the idea that moving, for a job or, moving back home to take care of family would put your whole marriage, place your whole marriage into this kind of unrecognized, status, that honestly just wasn't going to be a stable position that the country could hold for long. So in 2015, the Obergefell-Hodges decision pretty much made same-sex legal everywhere. And it's worth noting because sometimes people are like, why can't we wait? Why couldn't it have been put to a vote? Well, as you can kind of see, this is from 2013, so it's a couple years early. But although, the number of people who favored allowing gays to marry versus the number of people who were opposed, the favor was outpacing the opposed. It still wasn't that far from really 50-50. And, certainly if just by the basis of their sexual minority status, if we waited for the majority to agree to give rights to minorities, well, let's just say that a lot of minorities, not just sexual minorities, a lot of minorities would perhaps not enjoy the rights that they do. And, and so that's part of the significance of the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court decision. And so, you can kind of see that this question asking, basically saying it's always wrong or almost always wrong, you can see that there was this steady decline. But we certainly had not eradicated homophobia. We had not eradicated heterosexism, at the time that we granted marriage equality. And I would imagine that there is still a sizable minority of people who would still say that they have that belief if that question was to be asked today. So moving kind of away from sexual orientation to kind of some other aspects of sexuality, particularly sexual acts or sexual scripts, let's consider, some of the points from your book. That, because heterosexuality is seen as a given, homosexuality has long been viewed as needing to be explained. And it's oftentimes been seen as a form of deviance. And you can even see it by how, we think about sex or, what we count as being real sex. And your book discusses that through the concept of coital imperative, right? That we often think about sex as being defined as this, the penile penetration of the female, of the female body, usually the vagina. And so even our kind of definition of sex, what we think about as counting as sex is reflects this compulsory heterosexuality. And then, of course, when we think about kind of, sexual behaviors and sexual relationships, our dominant relationship model is associated with heterosexuality is monogamy. And your book talks about this in terms of mononormativity, that we have just kind of normalized the idea that that you have one sexual partner, that that you have one romantic partner. And mononormativity, I think what's interesting in America, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the family chapter, is, we used to think about monogamy as like you have one partner, as the vows state until, the day you die, until death do us part. But of course, in a country that has a pretty high divorce rate, and has had a pretty high divorce rate for, really the last 50 years now, almost. Now, of course, we're more of a serial monogamy country, right? We have one partner at a time, but we could have multiple spouses during our lifetime. And so that means that when your book discusses things like polyamory and open relationships, those things those forms of relationships have become increasingly popular forms of consensual non-monogamy, but they are still, largely, seen as being deviant, as seen as being, not, part of that mononormative model. Going beyond those concepts, what other types of sexual conduct between heterosexual partners has been considered deviant? Traditionally, there's been four types: premarital sex, which is your sex before marriage; extramarital sex, which is a fancy way of saying adultery or cheating. So it's you're married and you're having sex with someone who is not your spouse; promiscuous sex, which of course is very subjective, right? But it's the idea that you're having sex with too many partners, sex with too many people. And then finally, underage sex, once again, a kind of subjective element there, right? Because, what is underage, right? We have the age of consent in most states, but oftentimes that age of consent really only becomes important when you're thinking about, when one partner is older, or significantly older, a little older, doesn't matter, but they're older than the age of consent. But like, what about if, you have two underage people? How young is too young to have sex? And so, if you think about people's attitudes, like, how do we know that some of this is still deviant? Let's look at this slide right here. The percentage of people who say that this behavior is morally wrong. Married men and women having an affair. 91% of people in America in this sample, and it was meant to be a representative sample of American adults, they feel that this is wrong. 63% say sex between teenagers is wrong. 38% say gay or lesbian relations are wrong. 33% say premarital sex is wrong. And then, of course, there's also some questions about, having a child out of wedlock and divorce. So, there certainly seems to be that there are a sizable number of people in this country that still feel like there are some behaviors that are unacceptable, that are deviant in regards to sex. And I'm going to delve a little deeper into a few of those. So first of all, teen sex is a behavior that oftentimes, especially among adults, they can approach it from this very panicky standpoint because they often see it as being widespread and probably increasing. However, pretty much all the data that we have has suggested that adolescents having sex has actually fallen in past decades. We've used multiple data sources, and it's suggested that, teens are having less sex than previous generations of teens. So at this point, some of the adults that are freaking out about the ideas of teens having sex, they probably had a much greater likelihood of having teen sex themselves, or, having friends who did, than even the current teenagers. And among the teens who are having sex, it's worth noting that condom usage has increased, and teen birth rates have actually, gone down, because oftentimes that is the primary concern with regard to teenage sex, is the idea that teenage sex is going to result in unmarried teenage pregnancy. That is a much greater fear than disease, especially now that, people kind of perceive the AIDS, HIV epidemic as being under control, and pretty much all other STIs being, just a 7 to 10 day course of medicine. But there's this sense that, teenage sex that results in teenage pregnancy, will result in teenagers having their lives off track, not following, the success sequence of, graduating high school, going to college, graduating college, getting a job, establishing your career, getting married, being financially stable, maybe even owning a home, and then having children, right? That teenage sex kind of throws a wrench into all that. And, that attitude isn't totally without merit, as, certainly one of the predictors for poverty is related to out of marriage teenage wedlock. But as noted, teenage pregnancy rates in America have declined. At one point, it was declared a national crisis by President Clinton in 1995. And we'll talk about, what the response to that has been. But it has steadily declined since then. Although it's worth noting that, even though it's declined, we're still higher than other industrialized nations. Probably has a lot to do with, for a long time, it has a lot to do with healthcare access, and it has a lot to do with, reproductive, people's, kind of reproductive contraceptives, access to contraceptives, particularly contraceptives that have a lower failure rate, like hormonal birth control, IUDs, implants, especially among young populations. The United States, when compared to other countries, we do make it a lot harder and more expensive for teenagers to access that type of health care, particularly in areas of the country where they don't have, health clinics, accessible health clinics. So if we move beyond teenagers to just adults, what are some big takeaways, we can make about modern intimacy, sexual behavior among adults? Well, the kind of big takeaway is that sexual behavior is less constrained now than it has been in the past. And there are kind of three primary reasons for this. One of which is the advances in birth control. So sexual activity has been freed from being primarily connected to reproduction. There has been a greater acceptance of sex outside of marriage, and the number of social sanctions imposed on those people who engage in extramarital sex. We'll talk about the fact that the sexual double standard does still exist, but this is nothing like what it was in the past. And then, of course, the growing independence of young adults from parents has weakened the ties of parental supervision. Young people are now spending a prolonged period of time outside of their parents' homes without being married, right? They go away to college, they live in dorms, they live in their own apartments, they graduate from college and they, get jobs, all without getting married. If they don't go to college, they graduate, from high school and get a job, and once again are, more likely to move out of their parents' home and live on their own. And so all of this means that, sexual behavior is now seen as being more personal and intimate, and not merely a social requirement of reproduction. But just because it is more personal and intimate does not mean that we can't still talk about it from a sociological stance, because it is still being, these decisions, these norms are still being shaped by larger social forces. So one of those larger social forces, that was responsible for freeing up sexual norms and sexual behaviors, is, as they said, reproductive technology. And one of the early advances that really changed this was the pill. And it's still today the predominant form of birth control in the United States. And although there are positives and negative implications associated with this development, it was significant because it allowed women greater control over their own reproduction, and it can be done relatively privately. And it kind of shifted the responsibility from a man, where if you're talking about heterosexual sex, from a man, having to have a condom, to, women now being responsible, for their their reproductive, protection. Uh, it's also a more effective contraception than methods women had been using or avoiding using previously. So whether it was a condom or a diaphragm, the rhythm method, certainly the birth control is more effective at stopping pregnancy. Now the problem is it doesn't really stop. It doesn't stop the spread of AIDS, and there is certainly has been some research that suggests that during the 80s, when the HIV/AIDS epidemic spread to heterosexual women, that one underlying factor behind that quick spread was the fact that so many women were not having sex with condoms because they had grown reliant on using the pill. And of course, just, from a kind of health standpoint, it is a hormonal birth control method. And there is a very established historical research showing that when the pill was put on the market, it was kind of rushed to market. It did not necessarily it was not necessarily rigorously tested, especially long-term tested. And we now know that there are health implications, especially for women that stay on the pill for a prolonged period of time. And that's because, at least originally, that was never the expectation, that a woman can be on the pill for 25, 30 years, right? Because the idea was, of course, that she would at some point settle down, get a man, have babies, multiple babies, and therefore would not be reliant on the pill. But, the pill did kind of free up, as was noted, it freed up that link between, you have sex and you're going to be risking getting pregnant. So you need to make decisions around who you have sex with and how often you're having sex with that in mind. So once you didn't really have to think about that, unsurprisingly, we started to see some shifts in some of that other sexual behavior, including sexual behavior that had been labeled traditionally as being deviant. And so, just kind of based on our research in sexuality in America, some important takeaways. Forget what those people say about, premarital sex being morally wrong, because it seems like most Americans are having it. 95% of Americans have sexual intercourse before marriage. And although a lot of that sexual activity does take place between people who are in long-term relationships, and oftentimes there's even an expectation of fidelity and monogamy, if not eventual marriage, it's still just worth noting, people are not, by and large, waiting to have sex until after they say I do. There does seem to be this gendered aspect where men have more partners than women, although they're not having sex significantly earlier than women. The average age of first intercourse is 17 years for both. But by the time men are in their late 30s, on average, they've had 7 sexual partners, while women have had 4. And certainly some of that gap probably is explained by the sexual double standard and the stigma that women face for, engaging in free, non-constrained sexual experiences. They certainly face more stigma than men do. But, even just 7 and 4, those aren't ridiculously high numbers. So, maybe just kind of showing that, promiscuous sex, the idea that, having sex with too many partners, that at least in America, that's still largely kind of internalized as being a bad thing. And most people therefore don't engage in sexual intercourse with a whole lot of partners. People, and that's what your book notes. That's also what your research notes, right? That only 10% of men and 7% of women have 3 or more partners in a given year. So, for the most part, people aren't just kind of, sexing their way through the city. A lot of that sex is happening in committed, monogamish relationships. And then one thing that we'll talk about towards the end of this lecture, and it's come up in previous lectures, is sex without consent is relatively common. And so we'll talk about that more when we get to our section on rape culture. So, where does this sexual gender gap come from? This gap around, number of partners that men and women have over their lifetime. And, it's that gap is diminished in the last 3 to 4 decades, but it hasn't completely gone away. What can help us understand that? We're going to talk about some concepts here. We're going to talk about sexual socialization, sexual agency, and sex education. So, where did you learn about sex? Because that's what it means when we say sexual socialization, right? It's the idea that you had to learn, that you had to be taught about sex. You had to learn kind of what are the sexual norms and mores, values in your given society. And you probably learned, you probably got different messages from different socializing agents. And we've gone over socialization in a previous chapter, but yes, once again, socializing agents could be your parents, your peers, siblings. It could be your church. It could be the media, particularly pop culture, magazines, movies, television, internet. It could be your school, particularly through the form of sex education. So you can imagine that some of these socializing agents are probably going to be better or worse than others at presenting you with accurate, inclusive, non-judgmental, non-biased information. And some of these agents are going to be worse at doing that. So, we enter adulthood as individuals with like this mixed bag. Some of us maybe, received really good sexual socialization, and got really positive messages and healthy messages about sex, and some of us perhaps did not. Now, you think the great equalizer there would be the sex education, but in our country, because this has been such a controversial topic, that's just not the case. There are kind of two primary forms, or broad categories that sex education can take in this country. You could have comprehensive sexuality education, or abstinence only. And so it's worth noting that uh, during during the 90s, after teen pregnancy had been declared a national crisis, and then after Clinton, we had Bush come into office, and really kind of hitting hard, you know, uh, Republican talking points around family values and morality. There was this push in the federal government to promote abstinence only education, which is more or less what it sounds. For the most part, they only really provide information about abstinence. They don't spend a lot of detail or provide a lot of clear cut hands-on education around contraceptives, around different forms of sexuality, homosexual, bisexual orientations. Don't really provide a lot of information on masturbation. Um, it's a big focus on the message is you wait, and the federal government so wanted states, schools to promote that message, that they attached a lot of money to these abstinence only programs, and they were willing to give schools additional money if they adopted these abstinence only programs. And you can see that the states who took the money, those were the states where that you can see in gray. They're this in the states in pink are the ones who declined it. But what we've discovered is, not providing young people with the information they need to make important choices about their sexuality and sexual protection, reproductive health. It actually proved to be counterintuitive, because they still had sex, but now they did not know how to protect themselves, or there was a lot of shame around their decision, and so they didn't protect themselves. So the states, at least some of the states that pushed abstinence only, a lot of those states had some of the highest teenage birth rates, and that's what that map below that abstinence only funding is showing. You can see that like some of the states that had some of the highest places like Oklahoma and Texas and Arkansas, and Mississippi and Louisiana. Um, you know, um, Really almost the only outliers where you had states that didn't take the abstinence only funding money but still had relatively high teenage pregnancy rates were those southwestern states of New Mexico and Arizona. Otherwise you see that huge cluster in the South, and that was also the part of the country that most embraced abstinence only funding. Now since the Bush administration, now in the United States what we have is a mixed bag, because it's largely decided on the state level. The federal government during the Obama years, they did not really push for, and incentivize a specific type of sex education. And so what you see is, some states require it and it must be comprehensive, and some states don't require it. And some states require it, but it has to focus on abstinence. So that's why I said, when you're thinking about the fact, that schools are supposed to be maybe the equalizer of knowledge around sexuality, because we can't really control the messages that people get from their parents or their friends or their peers or even their church. Unfortunately, in America, that's also not the case. Schools aren't giving the same messages around sexuality. And so that means that people are kind of picking up their messages about sex from different people. And those messages, one way to kind of think about them and describe them is to use the term sexual script. Sexual scripts basically tell us who we should desire, what we should do, how we should act. It is like, if you think about, what a script is, if you've ever been in a play, it provides you, your line, it tells you how you should behave as a character. That's more or less what sexual scripts are. And a good example, and obviously they're socially constructed, so they're going to vary over time and over space between different cultures. But they are promoted and advanced in society through a variety of those socializing agents. And so we learn our sexual scripts from a variety of sources, and then we kind of internalize them. And so a good example of how it gets internalized, and then how a sexual script can kind of become persistent, like it can persist over time, is like the basis analogy. Don't know who actually created it first, and of course depending on where you live and how old you are, there might be some disagreement around what each base symbolizes, but this idea that we expect sexual activity to kind of progress in this fashion, to intensify in this fashion. That expectation is a sexual script. And what we are expecting at each base is a sexual script. And so sexual scripts, in addition to varying over time and between cultures, they also can vary between populations within a culture, particularly populations related to sexual orientation, because we have different expectations. We sometimes have different rules for men and women, for heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual men and women, in our society. And but just because sexual scripts persist does not mean they also can't be changed, because we also can think of the distinction between traditional sexual scripts versus contemporary ones, right? We've talked about in other chapters, dating scripts. So it's very similar, except now we're just talking about just solely on like a sexual basis. Your sexual scripts can interact and do interact with other hierarchical categories like age and class and race. So it's not just gender that matters here. Like our discussion of intersectionality has emphasized in various ways, other social identities also can come into play. And this can be particularly true when considering, the fact that um, sexual, preference, sexual attraction in this country is racialized. And so your book has a long discussion of this. The idea that, if you think about the erotic marketplace, right? So basically, like it's like the job market, except for sexual partners. In the same way that you can be a strong or weak job candidate, you can be a strong or weak candidate in the erotic marketplace. And what makes you strong and weak it is at least maybe partially related to, how closely you align or embody what's been deemed sexually attractive and that and or beautiful, and that of course is racialized. We discussed this when we talked about gendered strategies, right? That Black men are hyper masculinized, but Black women are also seen as being masculine compared to Asian women who are hyper feminized. But then Asian men are, more likely to be emasculated. And so, what this might mean is that people have these stereotypes. And this has kind of shaped their sexual preferences. And so, what we have in this country is a hierarchy of sexual desirability. And of course, this isn't like on an individual basis, right? Because it's not saying that, there would not be, some Black woman that, that would be more sexually desirable than some, random white woman, right? We're not talking about on an individual basis here. We're talking about on a group level. So if we're ranking people by entire groups, oftentimes, even though people, at this point in our society, it's not the type of thing that is acceptable to say, but it's often the type of thing that people do feel and they uphold in their dating preferences, that, some groups of people are more desirable than others. And, and we can see this and this was something that maybe that was just whispered or talked about, back when people were dating, meeting people out at clubs or restaurants or, their church or their schools, right? This sense of like, oh, I'm a Black woman and it seems like nobody here is interested in meeting me, or, oh, I'm an Asian man and it seems like nobody here wants to give me their phone number. But, the rise of online dating, first through websites and now, of course, through apps, it means that we now actually have data. We have the numbers and we can look at these trends and see to what extent is this true. And so, we can look at OkCupid in particular has been very transparent about providing their data, so that researchers can kind of understand, how this plays out. And so, whether they are talking about how they rate people or, who's more or less likely to get replies. I give you a video that pretty much goes over a lot of this data and some of the takeaway trends, but you can just kind of see that, oftentimes there are races of men and women who are seen, particularly by people outside of their group, as being less desirable. Um, and this is not the only form of what the authors call eroticized inequality. There is inequalities in regards to appearance. Men need to be bigger, they need to be stronger, they need to be taller. And so if you're a man who's not who's not those things, you have a liability in the erotic marketplace. There's age. There's less stigma of an older man dating a younger woman. I talked about that with the May-December relationships. That's such an awfully nice way to put it. But when an older woman dates a younger man, there's this stigma, this assumption she's being used. The term cougar. There is no kind of term for men who are older who date younger women. We haven't turned them into an animal term. We don't call them, I don't know, tortoises or something, but we have that term for women, SES. Your book talks about how, the significance of dating down for men versus women is different. And that's because for men, it's almost, expected, and in some cases even seen as desirable, that your female partner not be as educated or not have as high of an income. While for women, the expectation is that, if you're not going to date your equal, that you are going to, attempt to marry up. And your book talks about how, the MBA expected salary experiment kind of showed that women were aware that men maybe would be less interested in them, or they perceived that men would be less interested in them if they made a lot of money. So if when they knew that their expectations, their salary expectations were going to be public, then they gave lower salaries than when it was private. Um, like a lot of research, we don't have as much research. We don't have as much established research in our LGBTQ relationships. But your textbook does talk about that, in these relationships, um, women oftentimes have a slight preference for feminine women, and among men, um, who are interested in men, there's a larger preference for straight acting men. And they talk about this concept of what they call masking, which is kind of combining the word mask with masculine. But this idea that they're looking for, a gay male partner, but one who presents himself in this kind of hegemonic masculine light. So all of these just means that some of us go into the erotic marketplace, let alone the dating market, where you would imagine, the hurdles become even higher when people are thinking about, who they want to seriously date, and, maybe marry. But even just in the, sexual market, the erotic marketplace, we go into this marketplace and we have a different kind of advantages, and some of us have different disadvantages. And, research shows that not all of that is just individuated. Some of that's related to larger demographic characteristics. But going back to this kind of concept of a sexual script, let's talk about one that's, we've discussed previously, which is the sexual double standard. So first of all, let's just acknowledge that there's this gender binary when it comes to love and sex. Women are supposed to be interested in love, the relational imperative. They're supposed to want and seek out relationships. They're supposed to want to get married. And then men, of course, are not supposed to be interested in relationships. They're supposed to be interested in sex. And so, just kind of that belief, um, helps support this sexual double standard, where what happens is, we apply stricter moral or legal controls, even if you're thinking about it historically, to women's sexual behavior versus men. And a good way to kind of remember it is like slut versus stud, right? We're very quick to label, women sluts if they have sex too quickly, if they have too many sexual partners, if they, if they enjoy sex too much, even. But a lot of that same behavior, if it's displayed by a man, there isn't a negative stigma, there isn't a negative label. Instead, there's the much more positive connotation of him being a stud. And so, historically, the sexual double standard has resulted in, some informal codes of behavior for women. They must not initiate sex. Instead, they have to do this whole song and dance. Your book describes as the push and resist dynamic. This idea that men are supposed to push and women are supposed to resist to show they're not that kind of girl, but then eventually they give in. And of course, just thinking about this, from a rape culture standpoint, as we're going to talk about later, this is really problematic. Women are supposed to be passive sexually. We'll talk about that, the difference between being, having sexual subjectivity versus objectivity. Women should not have multiple sex partners. You can think about that in terms of they shouldn't have multiple sex partners at one time in their life, meaning, they shouldn't be sleeping with two or three guys. but then they also just shouldn't have, too many sexual partners in their past. That goes along with the idea that, women aren't expected and they're punished for being promiscuous, but men get a lot more leeway around promiscuity. Um, Women should only have sex within the confines of marriage. This goes back to that Madonna whore dichotomy, right? You're either a good girl who is, let me make sure that my computer doesn't restart. You're either a good girl who, does not, have sex outside of marriage, and therefore is deserving of being wifed, of being seen in that light, or you're a bad girl, you're a whore, in which case, no one is expected to want to, you know, uh, think of you or treat you in that way, in that respectable fashion. And dichotomy means that we kind of place women in this position where they're seen as either or, and they're kind of locked into these positions in terms of how people perceive them. And then, sex does not need to be enjoyable for women. That relates back to that whole sexual objectivity versus subjectivity. That kind of informal, sexual norm, sexual script certainly plays into the orgasm gap, which we will talk about in upcoming slides. And, it's just worth noting that, the double standard has become less prevalent, but it's still a prevailing sentiment in many areas and within many communities. And even in areas and communities where it's not a prevailing sentiment, it still persists, even in a diminished fashion. It has not been like stamped out by any means. And it can pop up in the weirdest places. So, there used to be, I don't know if you remember when that Drake song Hotline Bling was super popular, and you probably were just two-stepping and not listening to the lyrics. But if you actually listen to the lyrics, read the lyrics, there is a lot of kind of judgy, judging his ex for this behavior. And it's a clear double standard. The fact that, she's wrong for being out and partying with her girlfriends, being dressed in a sexy fashion for having fun, but the presumption is that, he isn't supposed to be held to that same moral code. And so that just kind of shows you how, the sexual double standard, it's not so much that it's acceptable for people to like say, oh, he's a stud, but you're a slut. But there are much more subtle ways in which we still uphold that sexual script, even in contemporary society. So now let's talk about kind of one of those other kind of sexual scripts that was related to the sexual double standard, which was that idea that women were supposed to be passive sexually. So there is this link, once again, this kind of gender binary about, how men and women are perceived to experience sexuality. Men are seen as being sexual subjects. They have agency. They are the aggressor. They're supposed to take charge. When it's that push and resist, they are the ones pushing. And your textbook describes that as sexual subjectification. They are the sexual subject. And oftentimes, especially, and this is more true with some partners than others, but, the sexual act ends with the man's climax because he is the subject. He is the hero of that sexual encounter. If the woman has not climaxed, in some cases, for some men, it's just kind of, oh, well. But maybe even more importantly is the fact that if the woman climaxes before the man, the expectation isn't that, that she has the right or the ability to then shut that interaction down, because as the sexual subject, his climax is supposed to matter. His is supposed to count. And that's because, societally, we oftentimes think of women as being sexual objects or sexual objectification. Their bodies are acted upon. They do not have sexuality. They are sexuality, right? It's not about their sex, the sexual act for them, but the fact that they are supposed to be sexy. They are supposed to be stimulating and whatever to the male. And there's this concept for that, the heterosexual male gaze, right? That it's less about what it feels like and more about what it looks like to him, right? If you think about some of those poses, if you've ever partaked in any type of pornographic material, there's no way that most of those poses are comfortable, particularly for women. And if they're not comfortable, then they probably are not enjoyable, unless you're a gymnast whose body really does just easily bend and contort in those ways. But it's that idea, that arch back and that tilted neck, right? That it makes your body look good to your partner, and he therefore finds that sexy. It doesn't matter if you don't find it sexy, if it's not helping you experience pleasure. Like, that's not the concern when you're the sexual object. And so that's that distinction that the authors talk about, that distinction between being sexy versus being sexual. Being sexy is about that sexual objectification, that heterosexual male gaze. It's about how you appear and look, and how your body is eliciting a response in him. While being sexual, of course, is about your own enjoyment, your own pleasure, not necessarily worrying about what you look like or sound like or what have you. But we know that, this sexual script, which is promoted by movies, commercials, uh, pornography, which I already just mentioned, we know that, this thing gets internalized into the heads of women, and they even self-objectify, right? They focus more on being that object and less on being that subject. Right? It becomes less about, I want to have this enjoyable sexual experience and I want to feel this way, I want to orgasm. And instead, it's more about, I want to look this way, and I want him to think that I am sexy. So much so that even in the midst of having the act, Wade describes how women can engage in what she calls spectating, where they really are so worried about what they look like during the act. Like, is my stomach jiggling? Can he see my cellulite? Is this making my stomach bunch up and rolls? They're so worried about how they look through the eyes of their usually male partner that they are not, in fact, enjoying the act. They're so worried about being good at being sexy that they're being horrible at being sexual. And so, unsurprisingly, what this results in is an orgasm gap. That, whether we are comparing, between hookups or being in relationships, there is this gap between men and women and their likelihood to have an orgasm. Women have the greatest likelihood of having an orgasm if they're in a relationship, and men do as well. But even then, there is that gap of 85 versus 68%. And the less well they know their partner, the less likely they are to have an orgasm. Because if it's their first hookup, for instance, only 10% of women have an orgasm versus 31% of men having an orgasm. Now, this could be because we know that the things that oftentimes women say make them most likely to orgasm, which is having a combination of intercourse, oral, and self-stimulation, this is less likely to occur um, when people are, and you can kind of see that, whoops, I went backwards. You can kind of see that in that data, that, it's when all those things occur that women are most likely to have an orgasm. But oftentimes, especially outside of relationships, there's also what we call the oral sex gap, where women are much more likely to give oral sex than receive oral sex. And so all of this, of course, is related to those sexual scripts. Now, certainly for younger women, part of what contributes to those sexual scripts, that concern over the sexual double standard, that orgasm gap, is that in the last, I'm trying to do the math in my head, because they first started talking about hookups and hookup culture when I was in college. So I guess, yeah, we'll say like in the last 20 to 25 years, there's been this kind of focus on this kind of new sexual context, and that is hooking up. And so, your book talks about, there isn't this clear-cut definition of what it means to hook up. Like, a lot of people think that it has to always mean uh, uh, having sex. But there are definitely ways of defining hookup that might relate to just fondling or just oral sex. It doesn't always mean intercourse. Sometimes it might even just mean kissing. But the kind of key thing about a hookup is it is occurring in a context where you are not necessarily, it hasn't been preceded by going on a date. And even if it occurs regularly, it does not necessarily relate to expectations that you are in a committed relationship, or certainly it doesn't relate to expectations that your partner has to share, that you are, in a relationship, a meaningful relationship. Um, while hookups, are more predominant among younger people, so you want to think 25 and younger, and they are particularly predominant on college campuses, particularly residential college campuses. It's not like everyone who is in that age group or in that setting is engaging in this type of behavior, and it doesn't mean that people who are older and are not in the college setting don't necessarily also engage in hookup behavior. But certainly, a lot of our research and data has come from colleges in particular. So, and typically, your kind of typical traditional college age students. So, your 18 to 22-year olds. And so, why do people hook up? Off sexual attraction, of course, kind of being a primary one. They've hooked up before. Very few people hook up because they want a relationship, but certainly, some people do hope that a relationship will result from hooking up, and we'll talk about that more in an upcoming slide. And then, of course, there's the role of alcohol and drugs, because hookups are much more likely, alcohol and drugs are much more likely to play a role in a hookup situation than in a date situation. So, why? Why does alcohol and drugs play a larger role? Once again, some of this has a lot to do with the fact that, our research is coming from that college setting. And over time, there has just been a close relationship, association, if you will, between, college, particularly residential college. So, the college where you live in a dorm and you're away from your parents. You're surrounded by people your same age and your same kind of situation, in terms of being, full-time students and probably unmarried and probably without kids, and parties. And so, the association between college and parties is a long-standing one. Now, where that association really changed, as your book mentioned, was in the late 1980s. Because before that, alcohol played a role in college and in college settings, but it was because people were legally allowed to drink in a lot of states, at the age of 18. But in 1987, the drinking age was increased to 21 in all 50 states. And so what happened is, all the places where students could kind of drink openly before, at school parties, in their dorm rooms, public places, a lot of those opportunities to engage in perhaps more responsible drinking dried up. And instead, now students if they were drinking, they were drinking illegally and underage. And so what happened was the Greek system, which had, very, very deep roots in higher education, even before this. The first fraternity were the Kappa Alphas, and that was in 1825. And in fraternities, and then later in fraternities and sororities, but particularly fraternities, had already had a long and established history of, having kind of, wild parties and hazing rituals and debauchery. But especially once people weren't able to legally drink in other places, the Greek system developed a real niche, because even though these houses were located on campus, on most campuses, these houses were private, which meant that, um, it was harder for the universities to regulate the drinking and partying behavior of the students in these houses compared to the students who were in like regular dorms. And so as your textbook describes, what happened is even if you weren't necessarily Greek, for a lot of campuses, Greek life became very central to party life, and it also played an outsized role in how colleges were depicted in a lot of popular media. That oftentimes fraternities and sororities, and those types of activities, people would see those depictions in popular TV shows and movies, and they would come to college expecting that type of experience. And so in that type of setting where you have a bunch of young people, usually binge drinking, heavily inebriated, these aren't the types of settings where smart decisions are getting made, or people making decisions about who they want to date seriously and possibly marry one day. Instead, a focus kind of becomes on having fun, engaging in risky behavior and hookups. And so you have the rise of hookup culture kind of happening, in this setting of colleges and party culture and drinking. Now, and it becomes, if not the predominant way in which young people in colleges structure their relationships, it becomes the predominant way in their mind that they think people are structuring the relationship. So they imagine that everyone is hooking up, even if they themselves aren't doing it. And even though, the data does not support the fact that everyone is in fact hooking up, because in fact, not everyone is. Once again, there is the role of, and your book talks about this, there is the role of race, and it's some of the same terms that, had been discussed previously. There's the hierarchy of social desirability, but then there's also a little bit of respectability politics happening where, minorities, people of color, feel like it's important for them to uphold a certain image, much more, important for them to uphold a certain image because there are less of them on campus. And that's particularly true if they're at a PWI, a predominantly white institution. There's the role of social class, which your book talks about. People that go to college that are working class, working poor, whether they're there on scholarship or having to work part-time jobs, they're oftentimes much more concerned about their grades and much more fearful of flunking out. And not to mention, it's really, if you're talking about the Greek system, like Greeks that have houses, it's really expensive to participate in that culture, to pledge, to rush, to live in a house. All of that takes money. So, people that are more disadvantaged in terms of their social class are just less likely to participate, and they perceive it as being riskier. And there's actually some evidence that suggests that for working class, working poor girls, it is riskier, that these upper class, these higher social class men are much more likely to sexually assault them, than women who share their social class background. And so, so in that way, it's doubly risky. And then, of course, just the role of gender. Once again, with that sexual double standard, women that overtly participate in the hookup culture, even though it is to some extent more acceptable and tolerated on college settings, they still run the risk of being labeled and being judged and being stigmatized, much more so than college age men do. Perhaps in those types of settings is where you still see maybe the clearest illustration of that slut versus stud distinction. Oh, I'm going backwards. Let me go forward. Now, as I mentioned, some people are motivated to hook up because what they really want are relationships. However, what's happened in these settings is the pathway to a relationship has become less clear because of hookup culture. And so, what you have now is what some people label backwards dating, right? Where instead of dating, getting to know someone, and then maybe becoming more sexually intimate with them, what happens instead in some situations is that people they start where they used to end, right? They're sexually intimate with a person, they hook up, but then they continue to hook up, and then they spend more time with them, and then they hang out, and then maybe they wind up dating. And it does happen that way, but it doesn't happen oftentimes as much as people, particularly women, based on the research that's been done, particularly that they would want. And so, because you're not clear cut dating, but you can have this kind of established, even maybe long term hookup relationship, what you have is this very vague language, right? You're talking, you're hanging out, you're dating, but not in a relationship. And so, all of this is just, purposefully vague, and it adds this element of insecurity, and it strips away expectations and obligations, relational obligations. And so, what oftentimes happens is that, um, you know, people do not oftentimes feel empowered in these relationships over time, and particularly women. And whether that's because, the woman does want a relationship, she is moving with that relational imperative, or in some cases, it's not so much that she wants a relationship, but that she, does not want to be negatively judged and stigmatized, which much more so than her male counterpart, she's really running that risk of doing so if she is overtly participating in this hookup culture. And your book talks about how, for both men and women, it's a cold, mean, in some cases, context, because they conflate caring with monogamy, right? You can be considerate and non-monogamous. You can be respectful and non-monogamous. You could hook up with someone and still be nice and still be respectful and still be considerate of their feelings and their sexual experience. But they said what's happened is that caring gets associated with relationships. And because hooking up is seen as being not that, oftentimes, like, the hookups just kind of result in, these kind of relations that are, if not flat, if not flagrantly disrespectful, just kind of inconsiderate. Once again, probably contributing to that orgasm gap. And so it raises this concern, particularly for young women. People just in general seem to be less concerned about sex when it comes to men. And I'm not saying that that's rightfully so. It's just a sexual script that we have, that women need to be protected from sexual, behaviors that are potentially predatory and exploitative. And, we don't have that same sexual script for men, particularly, heterosexual men. And so, there's this debate, and some people feel like it's problematic because it places women at risk. Some people just, find it problematic because in general, they're just kind of all worked up about the idea that people are out here having casual versus meaningful sex. And some people find it problematic because they're concerned when people embrace it as being questionable empowerment. Like, how is it really empowering to sleep with a bunch of men, or, to have a bunch of random hookups? So, if you're trying to answer that from a research standpoint, what does the evidence suggest? Well, certainly there are some risks, and certainly the empowerment is questionable. And that has a lot to do with the sexual double standard, and then just the sexual disrespect that exists in fraternity and party culture. It doesn't have to exist, but the way it's set up now, it often does. You know, the expectation that for a lot of these themed parties, that women are supposed to be, the men are oftentimes fully dressed while the women are in costumes that are like, half dressed, half naked. That there is this expectation that are agreeing to be like groped, just by your presence at those parties. So there is just a disrespect issue. And then, of course, the other reason is that, or another reason why it's seen as problematic, is because it, by and large, just results in bad sexual experiences. You can go back and look closely at some of those graphs, but for the most part, there's that persistent orgasm gap when you're having sex with someone who you don't really know, who doesn't really care about you. They are less invested, generally speaking, in women having a good time, and you can see that in the rates of uh, uh, you know giving oral sex, making sure that she has an orgasm. um, that data does just suggest that, if you think about women being sexual objects versus subjects, that kind of distinction becomes much more apparent in these hookup settings, or hookup contexts, than in relationship contexts. But that doesn't mean that, the research, suggests that relationships are inherently better. One thing that is certainly true is that hookups take less time than relationships. In particular, people who study, women's kind of social and romantic lives in college settings, one concern that comes up is what's called greedy relationships. That when women are in relationships, they oftentimes divest from other activities and academic experiences, and they are more apt to prioritize that relationship, which, to a certain extent defeats the purpose of being, there in college, where, you're hoping you're prioritizing some of those educational experiences. Certainly, in the same way that a bad sexual experience might result in someone becoming upset or anxious or depressed and their grades going down, there's also evidence that suggests that relationships, even when they're not bad, even when they're good, but they're just greedy in the sense that they take up a lot of time, also negatively impact, women's academic achievement, their GPAs. So this is almost kind of a double bind situation, to bring up a term that we've used in previous chapters. But sometimes it's not just a bad sexual experience like I didn't have an orgasm. Sometimes it's a bad sexual experience like I was sexually assaulted or I was raped. And so now we're going to kind of switch to rape culture, which is kind of our final topic from this chapter. So rape culture, I'm going to come back to this pyramid. Let me provide a quote from a book called Transforming a Rape Culture, and it gives a great definition. Rape culture is a complex set of beliefs that encourage male sexual aggression and supports violence against women. It is a society where violence is seen as sexy and sexuality as violent. In a rape culture, women perceive a continuum of threatened violence that ranges from sexual marks to sexual touching to rape itself. So now I'm going to go back to that pyramid because this is the point. In rape culture, what is so socially acceptable is the things that you see at the bottom of the pyramid. Rape jokes, victim blaming, locker room banter, sexist attitudes. Those types of things become normalized. And what happens is when it becomes normalized, it creates a foundation for worse and more threatening, more violent kind of activities and behaviors. And that's what you see when you go up a level in the pyramid, because the next level would be things like catcalling, stalking, unsolicited dick pics, revenge porn, right? things that degrade women, and it's built upon the fact that it's been normalized that women are seen in this type of society, through that kind of objectivity lens. And then we get to a higher level of the pyramid. Now we have safe word violations, covert condom removal, groping, right? So now you are removing autonomy. You're not allowing women equal say in the sexual experience. And then finally, at the top, you have explicit violence. You have your rape, you have your gang rape, you have misogynistic murder, you have just that kind of sexual assault, violence. And the idea is that, not that rape would not occur in a society that didn't normalize these behaviors, but it would be so much more rare. In rape culture, what is allowing those relatively high percentage of rape, molestation, sexual violence to occur is all of the people who are participating at it at its lower levels, at the levels where they can kind of make it seem like it's not a big deal, like, oh, it's just a joke, or, oh, don't be so serious, or, oh, that's just boys being boys, right? It's that foundation that allows the more explicit violence to thrive in a rape culture. So examples of rape culture can be things like blaming the victim, tolerating sexual harassment, inflating false rape report statistics, promoting gratuitous gender violence in music, movies, and television, teaching women to avoid getting raped, assuming that men don't get raped or only weak men get raped, pressuring women to not appear cold or prudish, pressuring men to score. So all of these are sexual scripts that we have in our society, more or less, and these are sexual scripts that contribute directly to rape culture. And when we focus just at the top of the pyramid, and ignore all of the much more likely, less intense, less violent behaviors towards the bottom of the pyramid, if we focus just at the top of the pyramid, we still have the type of numbers that just make it clear, that this is a real issue in our society. So this came up in the chapter on femininity when we discussed violence against women. So I'm not going to go back over it here, but just kind of just a point that the fact that, the frequency of rape is what it is, that's the evidence that it's normal, right? That it's not out of the normal. Like, it's not like, oh, I got abducted by aliens and everybody would be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened to you. Like, that is so crazy and rare. Like, unfortunately, rape in our society for women is not that. Most statistics put it somewhere between 18 to 20%. So it's normal in the sense that it's a common occurrence, and it commonly occurs, along with our other life experiences. And that's because it is not likely to be the stranger in the bushes. It's much more likely to be an intimate partner or former intimate partner, an acquaintance, which would include like a first date. Even a family member is more likely to rape a woman than a stranger. So, the fact that it's people that we routinely interact with in some way, that's part of what is contributing to the commonality. Now, another kind of piece of evidence you can kind of point to as proof of how this society was, has a long history of having a rape culture is marital rape. Because before the 1970s, most cases of marital rape were not even covered by rape laws. Like, it was a state by state kind of basis, and it took pretty much almost uh, a decade and a half, 2 decades, for all the states to now have rape laws on the book. And that's because it was presumed that women, when they consented to get married, that they consented to sex for the entirety of their marriage. Once again, just kind of pointing out this idea that women are seen as sexual objects and not subjects. So because of that kind of lack of sexual subjectivity and agency, marital rape was just kind of like unheard of. Like it was just like a concept that didn't exist. Now, of course, rape within marriage is now illegal, in all the states. But because of cultural beliefs held by many, convictions are still difficult to obtain. And in a lot of cases, a lot of women don't even come forward. In a lot of cases, they aren't even necessarily comfortable using the word rape to describe what their husband did to them. Instead, they talk about stories like, I really wasn't interested, or I was half asleep, or I woke up to him doing this and I wasn't that into it. Nobody wants to necessarily define their husband as being a rapist, particularly if the rape did not come along with, explicit violence. And so in that way, that old idea that rape within marriage is impossible, even though we changed the laws, the idea itself has persisted, right? That, there is still that kind of sexual script. Now, I mentioned the fact that, marital rape is people rarely come forward and it's rarely convicted, but it's just worth noting that that's generally the case with rape in general. It is underreported crime, and it is a under it is an underreported crime, and it's the type of crime where oftentimes it is not likely to result in a conviction. And if it does result in a conviction, it's highly unlikely, that the perpetrator will spend any real significant time in jail. And so, these statistics kind of tweak every couple of years, but in general, about a little under half of the rapes get reported to the police. So when we compare the data that we have on, women who say they've been raped versus police statistics, it's under half. And then when it does get reported to the police, a lot of them don't lead to an arrest, because oftentimes there is what is considered to be a lack of good evidence, and police have historically been very reluctant to pursue cases that are largely just based on what's perceived to be he said, she said, differences in opinion and stories types of cases. Of the ones that do lead to an arrest, then only, the 12, percent that do, then only 9% get prosecuted, because even once the police maybe make the arrest, the prosecutor has to decide, to take the case. And, is it a good enough case to go to trial? And then once at trial, they then have to convince a jury to convict. Only about 5% lead to a felony conviction. People plead down, they accept plea deals, and oftentimes, they're just found not guilty. And this was, especially more likely to be, the case in previous decades, pre Me Too in particular. There was this sense that, if it wasn't a violent stranger danger type of rape, if you're talking about a rape that occurred at a party or, on a date, there was a lot of victim blaming, and there was this strategy that defense attorneys would use, the nut versus slut strategy, where they would either try to paint the female victim out to be crazy, or to paint her out to be, sexually promiscuous, a whore. And, going back to that kind of, rape myth, or, sexual script, around rape victims, is that idea of like, can a whore, can she really be raped? And so that was a successful way to get their clients off. And then, even if there was a felony conviction, doesn't necessarily mean that the rapist will spend even a single day in prison. And then we won't even talk about the ones who then spend significant time in prison. Just think back to that Brock Turner case, and, even with witnesses, and for that sexual assault, 6 months, but then was out in 3. So, all of that, of course, just leads to people being um, much less willing to come forward for this type of crime, versus getting your purse snatched or your car broken into, and it's not like murder where there's this clear piece of evidence, a missing person or a dead body, which kind of makes the police have to press charges and look to make an arrest. So all of this that just kind of complicates, um, the kind of policing around rape. But if we specifically return back to our campus and focus on campus and hookup culture, when we look at our college statistics, it becomes 1 out of 5 women and 1 in 16 men. And there is a unique form of rape that often happens in these college and in some cases even high school settings, and it's called party rape. And this is rapes that occur in the context of a party. Oftentimes they involve a victim and sometimes a perpetrator who are incapacitated with alcohol, in some cases drugs. And so particularly for this type of rape, there are kind of two theories, and both of them have some support when you look at the data. So one theory is that rape is a crime committed by dangerous psychopaths, that colleges just have a certain percentage of serial rapists. And, based on data, 4% of college men do admit to more than one act of sexual violence. And among that sample of men, the average is 6 rapes each. So there definitely seems to be some men who are going to college and are raping multiple women and are aware that that is what they are doing. But then with party rape, there's also this other theory, and that's that rape is situational. So, I'm not saying that it's not a crime, but, what does that mean? Rape is situational. This is where the role of alcohol plays a big part, because oftentimes when both parties have been drinking, and then you add to that those sexual scripts that men and women have been raised within the society, the push and resist script, the sexual double standard, the woman as sexual object but not sexual subject, it can lead to people making bad decisions, criminal decisions in the case of rape, and that they do not necessarily always recognize in that moment that that is what they are doing, and that they are in that moment committing a crime. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But once again, you can point the finger also to larger social forces, because we do have in our media, we present these types of this situational rape as if it's normal, as if it's not problematic, as if it's not criminal. The whole plot of that movie, Superbad, which, I'll admit I watched the movie and I laughed at parts of it. But, that whole plot was about them, tracking down alcohol to get these girls drunk enough to agree to have sex with them. And that is problematic. And the fact that that's presented as okay, and the fact that that is a contemporary sexual script, this idea that you ply a woman with alcohol to get her drunk enough to say yes, even though, of course, that flies in the face of what consent is supposed to look like. So in this way, hookup culture is implicated in both theories. And that's the point that your book makes. Hookup culture is rape culture on college campuses. And that's because, hookup culture allows rape culture to hide in plain sight. It's hard to tell the difference between one of those psychopath serial rapists and just, a regular guy looking for a hookup. And it's hard for that regular guy to necessarily know that he is in a situation where he doesn't really have consent if we put out these messages that in hookup culture, you're supposed to be drunk, you're supposed to be having fun, you're supposed to be having this drunken sex, even though, of course, that type of sexual activity flies in the face of our consent laws. And so all of this it just relates to, once again, those gendered sexual scripts. There's the saying, a man who hesitates masturbates. And once again, that focus on, for men, they receive those messages that they're always supposed to be pushing for sex. They're not supposed to take no for an answer. That they're taught that of course she's going to say no. She wants to come across as a good girl. So they're taught that push and resist dynamic, that they're supposed to be the pushers. They're supposed to keep trying to overcome her resistance. So it raises the question, do nice guys, good men know when they cross the line? If what they're taught is to be manly, you should be, going right up to the line. You should be pushing it. You should be pushing boundaries, because that's what men do. They go after sex. They pursue sex. They're aggressor. They're sexually aggressive. And you can't expect women to be sexually aggressive, because we have this gendered message that that's not what women do. Obviously what it does is it does create the context where, what they might be perceiving as a ploy or a strategy on the woman's part is not a ploy or a strategy. That they are in fact assaulting her. And research does show that of the men who admit that they did commit rape, most of them are not those 4% who are serial rapists. They're 4 out of 5 who commit rape before graduating, and they do so one time. And oftentimes when you get their stories, they align with that situational theory. Lots about alcohol and misread communication and signals, and misinterpreting. And of course, none of that helps, of course, the woman who was victimized in that situation, right? The fact that he only did it once, that does not make her feel any better. But what it does do is it emphasizes, of course, that, we do need new sexual scripts, particularly around consent. And so, colleges in particular have attempted to do this. California was one of the first states that transitioned from no means no to yes means yes, because no means no required someone to answer in the negative, to tell someone, no, stop doing that. Now, first of all, that was problematic in the sense of, like, what if you were drunk or passed out, or for a lot of women who, maybe did not feel comfortable shutting things down. What about if they gave a tentative, verbal hedge, which we do know from communication patterns, women are more likely to do. So what if they said things like, I don't think we should do this, or I'm not sure if I want to do this, or, maybe we should, wait, right? None of those are necessarily explicit no's, but clearly they're not a yes. So yes means yes. The word for this is affirmative consent. It's the idea that you should be waiting to see if someone is going to give you specific, enthusiastic, non-coerced consent to engage in a sexual act. Now the problem is, this is coming from someone that when I left CSUB, a year and a half ago, I initially left and took a job where that was my job. I was the interpersonal violence coordinator at a campus, and I would go around, and part of what I would do is I would do consent workshops. But part of that yes means yes is that sexual script, that policy does not align with the sexual scripts that we are still feeding women, because yes means yes means, embracing your sexual agency, embracing your sexual subjectivity, stating your desires and making them plain, not playing the push and resist game, and that, that means potentially, by putting your desires out there, it means perhaps running afoul of the sexual double standard. So, part of the struggle with getting college students to embrace the yes means yes versus the no means no laws is because it's running counter to some of those other sexual scripts. And this is just a funny image that a student once included on a assignment. But it just once again shows that when we've given this sexual script for men to keep pushing, for men to be aggressors, when we've set it up that, it's advantageous to them to not take no, not take the first no for an answer. It does lead to these situations where, there's this thin line between, going for it and being a sexual predator. So, how do colleges try to combat this? Certainly, bystander intervention, so teaching people to be active bystanders that get involved when they see something, is the most effective way. However, a lot of students just choose to not get involved. And we know this because there have been so many cases where students, have leaked photos and cell phone footage where they are clearly witnessing sexual assaults, but they're not doing anything. These sexual assaults are occurring at a party, and instead of students stopping them, they're taping, they're laughing, you know, they're not stopping the crime, or in a lot of cases, they're not even reporting it. Um, Once again, this is where party culture, hookup culture, and rape culture, where that conflation can just become very problematic. Some students view this as part of the fun of the party culture, that you're going to witness, people doing crazy things, girls and guys getting crazy. And this idea that, this can just be a crazy thing that's going on, this impacts people's willingness to be active bystanders, right? Because nobody wants to be, the fun cop. Nobody wants to stop the fun. And so, that's part of what makes bystander intervention, hard to successfully implement on campuses. The other reason why college rapists get away with it is the role of power and influence. Um, a large percentage of the serial rapists, that 4% that we've talked about, were oftentimes male students who had power and influence on campus. Predominantly, it was men who were involved in the Greek system, which we've already explained, the kind of central role that Greeks that have houses play on residential campuses. And then also student athletes, particularly in the sports that are associated with money making sports, your basketballs and your footballs and your baseballs, if you will. And so what happens is that those students in particular are more likely to feel like that they are advantaged in the erotic marketplace. So they, are more likely to perceive women as being sexual objects, kind of there for them, the comparative to other men. But it also, when they become serial rapists, it makes it less likely that other students will get involved, that they'll be reported. And unfortunately, it even makes it less likely that the schools, the universities will do anything if people make those reports. And that has certainly been an issue that Title IX in the last 10 years has tried to push back against. If we look beyond college campuses, we can see this play out on the national stage, with cases like Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein and Roman Polanski and R. Kelly, and there have been all these cases where you wonder how can someone rack up that long of a list of victims, but it was because for such a long period of time they were protected by their power and their influence. Their power and influence gave them greater access to women who did not perhaps know that they were going to be victimized, but then it also gave them greater protection, once that victimization took place. Which brings me to my final point, which is about victims. Because the other reason why rapists get away with it is because oftentimes victims do not want to come forward. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, particularly in college campuses with your party culture and your hookup culture, you don't have what's considered to be a perfect victim. A perfect victim is someone that was, dressed in non-provocative clothing, going about their daily routine when they are attacked or accosted by a stranger, and they hadn't been drinking and they hadn't been doing drugs, and they don't have a problematic sexual, history or past. So that's what the perfect victim looks like, because then when people hear her rape story, what's unlikely to happen is victim blaming. But the fact of the matter is that is not the story of most victims. Instead of the perfect victim, what we often have is a typical victim. And especially if you're talking about the typical victim on a residential college campus, it is oftentimes a young woman that was at a party. She had been drinking. She perhaps was dressed in provocative clothing. And none of that means that someone had the right to rape her. But unfortunately, what it does mean is that if she comes forward, if she becomes part of that less than half who come forward to the police who report, she has to deal with the scrutiny of having all of those actions, all of those ways in which she's not the perfect victim. She has to deal with having all of that scrutinized. Because victim blaming and slut shaming, which kind of go hand in hand, in terms of sexual scripts, those are contemporary sexual scripts. We oftentimes blame the victim, and we talked about that in chapter 7, particularly why women blame the victim as well as men, giving them that false sense of security. Well, I'm not that type of girl, and that will never happen to me. But in reality, in rape culture, with 20% of women having a rape, happening to them at some point in their lives, the fact of the matter is, it's a false sense of security. There is no perfect way to avoid, being raped. And once again, the fact that we teach women to avoid being raped versus teaching men to not rape, is a sexual script. And so, that question, which, I didn't start the chapter off with, but, this is where we'll end, that question for this chapter, gendered ideas, interactions, and institutions may affect almost every part of my life, but some things are personal and my sexuality is mine and mine alone, isn't it? Well, the clear-cut answer here is no. Whether you're talking about sexual scripts, whether you're talking about sexual norms, whether you're talking about changing kind of perceptions of sexual deviance, whether you're talking about the creation and construction of different sexual identity terms, right? All of that is social, all of that is sociological, right? Obviously you have some individual choice here. It's not like you're stripped of all your agency, but that agency, like everything else in your life, it is occurring in a larger social context. So I know this chapter was pretty lengthy, but hopefully I did a good job of explaining the material from the book, even though I didn't present it in the same order as the authors, as well as the additional material that I provided you.